silence has prevented both the policy community and the broader audience to hear the new generation of scholars who are able to work in Eurasia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and who was offering a more complex and more nuanced reading of the so-called revival of religion. Our initiative hopes to fill the gap in giving the floor to this new generation of scholars, mostly political scientists and anthropologists, knowing local languages and local culture, and to engage in a constructive dialogue about the diversity and the multiplicity of meaning of Islam in Eurasia. These Tuesdays have been divided in several panels and sessions. Today, after our keynote speaker, we will have two panels looking at both top-down and bottom-up dynamics. The first panel will be looking at state influence in shaping religion, and the afternoon panel will be looking at grassroots transformation, and we hope with that in engaging a dialogue between political scientists and anthropologists. Tomorrow we will highlight a key aspect of Islam in Eurasia, which is the ongoing globalization. We will discuss how Eurasian Islam interacts with the rest of the world through travels, migration, proselytizing movements, but also through social media, and for a very small minority of people through engaging in theater of insurgency. With that, we hope to create a new space of discussion that will take into consideration all the actors of Islam, state, grassroots activists, radical groups, but also average citizens, young people, women, diaspora, students, labor, migrants, and try to offer a richer picture of Islam in Eurasia. First, I would like to thank also Professor Peruz, who was really the one who has been organizing this event, and Ashley Bandura, my program officer, and my two interns, Chris and Matthew, who have been helping organizing this event. Now I would like to give the floor to our keynote speaker, Pauline Luong, who is Professor of Political Science and Director of the International Institute at the University of Michigan. Many people know her. She has been working on the 5 Central Asian states and published several articles in leading academic and policy journals, including the American Political Science Review, Annual Review of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Foreign Affairs, Politics and Society, Europe-Asia Studies, and Resources Policy. Pauline is also a member of CONARS Eurasia, which is hosted here at GW, through which she has written numerous policy memos concerning the politics and economic trajectory of Central Asia. Pauline's books include Institutional Change and Political Continuity in Post-Soviet Central Asia, Power, Perception and Pacts, The Transformation of Central Asia, States and Societies from Soviet Rule to Independence, Oil is Not a Curse, Ownership Structure and Institution in Soviet Successor State, and more recently the book we are all waiting for, Islam, Society and Politics in Central Asia. And she's now currently working on the social and political impact of Central Asian Islamic revival since independence, and that's on that issue that she will be delivering her speech today. So Pauline, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Sebastian, for inviting me here today. I'm very honored. Let me just get this set up here. I'm very honored to be here today, and particularly because I think this conference is a real opportunity not just to showcase the work of younger scholars in the region, but also an opportunity to reassess Central Asia's Islamic revival, or more correctly, to reassess our study of Central Asia's Islamic revival. Not the study necessarily of people in this room, but people outside this room, for the most part, who have influenced the study for most of the 1990s and early 2000s, versus those of us who are sort of trying to bring it forward in the mid to later 2000s. Let me say a little bit more about what I mean by that. I think for most of the 1990s and 2000s, the study of Central Asia was dominated by 3 perspectives. And these 3 perspectives, I would argue, led us astray. They led us astray because they encouraged us to make assumptions that blinded our analysis. And as a result, I think we lost a lot of insight into the nature and meaning of Central Asia's Islamic revival as it was happening on the ground, and therefore the types of inferences we could draw about Central Asia's Islamic revival for the social and political impact that it was having or would have. Since roughly the mid-2000s, however, I think we have gained crucial insights into the nature and the meaning of Central Asia's Islamic revival, And I think we have gained enough insights that we now have something called cumulative knowledge. I think we're starting to accumulate knowledge about what the median impact is, and I think that's an important thing for scholars and scholarship to do. So this is great timing for the Henry Luce Foundation to be funding this type of initiative. And I would like to add that many of the reasons why we've gained so much insight since roughly the mid-2000s is because of a group of scholars, many of whom are in this room, some of whom couldn't be here today, who abandoned these three perspectives that I'm saying, I think, for a long time have blinded us to many of the insights, or at least relaxed them. Right? Not to say they're completely irrelevant, but that they were too dominant and therefore blinding. So what are these three perspectives? The first is the legacy of Soviet rule, and alongside that, Sovietology, and the meaning of Sovietology, and the sort of interpretation that Sovietology had of Islam in Central Asia. That very much dominated how we viewed and analyzed the Islamic revival in Central Asia. The second is Central Asia as part of the periphery rather than the core of the Islamic world, right? That it's not the Arab states are the core, Central Asia was the periphery, and as I'll talk about in more detail later, therefore Central Asians had much to learn from real Muslims who were practicing real Islam in the dominant Arab core. And finally, the international context, the fact that these states became independent, the revival transpired during a time when you had the emergence of very strong transnational Islamist movements. So what did we lose by having these three dominant perspectives, or what did these three dominant perspectives cause us to lose? Well, as I said, the first one, the Soviet legacy and Sovietology, really hindered our analysis by this immense sort of presumed weight of the Soviet past. That really what we need to think about and reflect on is, and view everything through, right, is the lens of Soviet rule. And so the Islamic revival itself was a reaction to, a reaction to the end of Soviet rule, right, and policies, Soviet policies, were sort of the impetus for the types of policies that Central Asian governments pursued. And that might be partly true, right? It's not to say that it was irrelevant, but it wasn't sort of the only factor clearly influencing both the revival itself and the policies that were employed by the post-Soviet leaders in Central Asia. So I think what this led to, again, twofold, was this sort of mischaracterization of Central Asia's revival as simply the resurgence of beliefs and practices that had been suppressed under Soviet rule. Obviously, it was much more complicated than that, and we know much more about that now that we have this sort of new group of scholars looking at Islam on the ground. I'll talk about more later. This, of course, is also tied to the notion that Soviet repression of public practice led to an Islam, or reduced Islam, to rituals that were un-Islamic somehow. Right? This is something that Devin Dweese and others, many anthropologists have talked about, this mischaracterization of this resurgence of beliefs as something that was partially in reaction to being forced to pursue un-Islamic rituals and traditions, when in fact they were very much, as I'll talk about later, part of Central Asia's Islamic tradition. There's also, to emphasize this, the notion that Central Asian state policy was simply a continuation of Soviet policy. That government regulation of Islam via the Muslim boards, for example, which happened in the early 1990s, was really all about sort of reasserting secular Soviet policy, when in fact many of these Muslim boards had been indigenized and assimilated into Islamic religious life. So it was also sort of a very sort of positive way of Central Asians continuing a policy that they had seen as already indigenized and assimilated and a sort of normal part of religious regulation. And seeing, again, repressive policies, so not just regulatory policies under the Soviet Union, but repressive policies toward Islam as part of the Soviet legacy, when in fact there were many domestic incentives and domestic motivations. And I'm not talking about radical Islamist groups, I'm talking about self-preservation in the wake of declining legitimacy, which many of the scholars in this room have talked about. And there's these domestic motivations that really led leaders to be repressive toward Islam in a variety of ways, and not just the Soviet past and what they inherited from the Soviet past. So I think what this led us to do was to fail to see the distinctiveness of regulation, both repressive policies and subsidy-based policies in post-Soviet Central Asia. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. I'm talking about what we've lost now, and I'll segue into what we've gained. So the second thing I think we lost, or what we lost by the second perspective that dominated the analysis of Central Asia's revival in the 1990s and part of the early 2000s, is Central Asia as on the periphery of the Islamic world. So what this meant was that the Islamic core was seen as the best reference point for what we could expect to happen in Central Asia, but also for the way that we could evaluate the revival itself and the meaning of the revival, the direction it would take, the form it would take. Right? So the Islamic core, like the Arab world, was seen as the emblematic of what was real or true or authentic Islam, and Central Asians were seen as, therefore, needing to borrow and learn from the Arab core. What this meant was that true Islam in the Central Asian context was seen as very unidimensional, right? It was going to be scriptural only. So Central Asians, this revival was going to be primarily about regaining a sort of scriptural basis, a textual basis for piety. It wasn't going to be a resurgence of other types of what we're calling the Soviet Union more traditional, right, forms of Islam in Central Asia, which couldn't have been, as we discovered later, further from the truth. The second was that this notion that the revival was going to be unidirectional. So not only was the revival going to be unidimensional, it was all going to be about spiritual, regaining this sort of knowledge of spiritual and textually based piety, right, from the Quran and the Hadith, the Quranic-based scriptural basis for piety. But it was going to be unidimensional in the sense that, or I'm sorry, it was going to be unidirectional, right, in the sense that it was going to be in this direction of a more conservative, scripturally based interpretation of Islam. So since Islam was seen as unidimensional, the revival itself had to be going only in that direction, right, and not the separate direction that would be both conservative toward more scripturally based interpretation of Islam and more mystical or spiritual interpretations that we'll talk about later. Again, this is based on the presumption that Central Asians, in contrast, because they're on the Islamic periphery, in contrast to the Arab core, were bad Muslims, that they didn't know Islam, right? And the Soviet legacy had cut them off toward knowledge of what real Islam was, right? So the revival itself had to be about cleansing, had to be about the purification of Islamic beliefs and practices, right? Which then again, reinforced this notion that the revival itself would be unidirectional. Finally, the revival itself was seen as inherently political, right? Because when the Arab states, again, being the reference points, when the Arab states experienced an Islamic revival, because it became eventually political, it was politicized, right? This notion was that we already knew the end point. We knew that Central Asia's Islamic revival was going to be politicized, just like it was in the Arab world, not taking into account all the structural, social, political, economic factors that politicize Islam in these other contexts, in the context of the Arab world. The third dominant perspective that I think caused us to lose a lot of insights in at least the first decade after Soviet rule was this notion that the international context was so important and dominant, the international context in which Central Asia became independent. And what this caused us to do was to privilege the transnational Islamist forces and because they were on the rise, as having the greatest influence on Central Asia's Islamic revival, right? This influence would not only be enormous, right? It would also be quite negative, right? So our analysis was blinded by thinking that we had to focus on these outside influences. We didn't need to look for sources of internal influence, right? Rather, we could look to how, why, and whether these transnational forces would gain a foothold in Central Asia. This is part of what Marlene was talking about earlier with the securitization of Islam. There's this sort of automatic securitization of Islam, so that's what was a security threat. It's all going to come from outside. And so not only would it be enormous and negative, but it would trump any internal sources that could possibly influence the nature and meaning of the Islamic revival in Central Asia. So we paid less attention to these internal sources. There was little attempt, at least initially in the 1990s, to document and examine sort of the broad field of religious specialists, the broad field of religious practitioners, including this so-called unregistered during the Soviet period. And this, I think, blinded our analysis to the importance of these internal influences. So what we've gained by a group of scholars who I think has basically eschewed or minimized the influence of these three dominant perspectives and offered other perspectives is a multitude of really important insights. The first is that Central Asia's revival is multifaceted, right? And that its meaning and impact, social and political impact, is therefore very unpredictable, right? It's not unidimensional, unidirectional, and therefore predictable in terms of its outcome, By the mid-2000s, I think we have gained a much deeper, beginning in the mid-2000s, I think we've gained a much deeper understanding of Central Asia's Islamic revival. Again, linked to the efforts of scholars who have been committed to studying Islam on the ground as it's lived, to taking it seriously, to answering, in some ways, Devin Deweese's call for a religious studies approach to Islam in Central Asia, and not just a Sovietological one. What does it mean to say that the nature of Central Asia's revival is multifaceted and its outcome therefore unpredictable? Well, I think what we find in Central Asia through many of the writings, primarily of anthropologists, but some of the work that political scientists have done as well, is that there's really this immense diversity of beliefs and practices in Central Asia. So again, it's neither unidimensional. The expression of Islamic piety in Central Asia is neither unidimensional, it's not just scriptural, and it's not unidirectional, it's not just in a more conservative direction, right? Rather, I think what we see what I call in a new work that is endlessly forthcoming, is a pluralism of piety, right? And here I'm borrowing a bit from Noah Tucker and some of the work that he's done, which I think is brilliant. This range of beliefs and practices, not along a single dimension, right? So it's not just one dimension of either you're more textual or scriptural on one end, or you're more spiritual and mystical on the other, but I see it as a two-dimensional spectrum. So it's not a single continuum, but rather a two-dimensional spectrum where Central Asians are exploring, yes, they're exploring more textual and scriptural basis for piety, but they're also exploring and transforming more traditional and mystical. And so rather than seeing religion, and political science tends to do this for all religions, as a very unidimensional, right, just looking at, this is a basis of one dimension of how textual or scriptural, how well you adhere, right, to the textual or scriptural basis for piety. Central Asians, I think, are very much exploring along both dimensions, both within Central Asian communities and within Central Asia themselves, so that one Central Asian could be exploring both. One community, one small community within Central Asia, one region, one state can be exploring both at the same time. So there's a multiplicity of expressions of piety, which I think is a really important insight that we missed. Not we in this room, but the study of Central Asia, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s. And so when I say pluralism of piety, what I mean is sort of this combination, that there's really multiple ways of viewing how you can be a quote-unquote good Muslim, right? How you can express piety. That is a real mix of these things, as opposed to just a continuum of on one side or the other. And I can say more about that in some of the interviews that I've done that reveal this in the Q&A if people are interested. I can also say more about what I mean by pluralism and why I use the term pluralism rather than syncretism. I think that syncretism is often misused and misapplied. It's not just it's not just a blending of local beliefs and practices with Islamic ones, but it's actually seeing them as equally legitimate, right, in terms of expressions of Islamic piety. Finally, precisely because, going back to this first point on seeing the revival as multifaceted, precisely because we've discovered that there's so much diversity, right, that there's this pluralism of piety when it comes to Central Asia and its Islamic revival and how it's being expressed on the ground and how it's being lived on the ground. It's very difficult to draw the type of knee-jerk gut reaction inferences about the relationship between rising levels of religiosity on the one hand and any kind of political attitudes and behavior on the other, or the social and political impact of Central Asia. We really can't predict, or we at least really couldn't in the 90s and 2000s. Things have changed with state regulation and state repression and things, but we really couldn't predict what the political impact of this revival was going to be, right? Because usually, right, if we just go back to these, usually when we look only at this dimension, the idea is you see people on a continuum of how fundamentalist they are, and then you think the more fundamentalist they are, the more likely they are to support, for example, radical Islamist groups. Well, in fact, if it's two-dimensional, right, not only is it hard to put people, right, I'm going to argue it's very hard to place people here or here, that's the minority. The majority are here, whoops, here in the middle, right? It makes it really hard to also put people in a box of you have fundamentalist beliefs and practices when it comes to, or solely fundamentalist beliefs and practices when it comes to Islam, therefore you're going to support only groups or ideas or governments that support these beliefs and practices. If you have more of a blending, it's more difficult to draw sort of any kind of linear analysis between your beliefs and practices and the types of political groups you might support, or political ideas you might support or hold. So the second insight I think we've gained by this new set of scholars and just the willingness to shed some of these dominant perspectives has been insights into the distinctiveness of policies, state policies in Central Asia. Not only have there been some very clear reversals in terms of state policies, right, such as the promotion of Sufism, which fatwas in particular promote Sufism in several of the Central Asian countries, including Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, most recently in Tajikistan, which is it's a clear reversal of Soviet policy, of course, in which Sufism was seen as tantamount to against the state, right? So there have been some clear reversals in policies that have been pointed out by more recent scholars. There's also, I think, something that needs to be pointed out more, and something I've been working on, which is there's this really interesting and distinct mixture in Central Asian state policies of repression and subsidy. So Central Asian governments, all of them, to differing degrees, want to regulate Islam. They want to control Islam. And that, in and of itself, is not widely opposed by society. So again, as I mentioned before, the Muslim boards themselves are sort of indigenized. Right? There's this idea that the government had some role in regulating and controlling Islam, right? It was the extent to which they did it and the form in which they did it, right? So this mixture of repression and subsidy, I think, is very distinct, both from Soviet policy and from the way that it's practiced in other parts of the Islamic world. In all parts of the Islamic world, there's also an attempt to control or regulate Islam. And I think that the way in which Central Asian governments sort of mix repression and subsidy is distinct in three different ways. Let me first define what I mean by repression and subsidy. So when I talk about religious repression, right, these are both forms of regulation. When I talk about religious repression, I mean efforts to restrict the practice or profession of religion. And when I talk about subsidy, I mean efforts to support, whether institutionally, fiscally, right, financially, or politically support. Okay? And I think it's sometimes very difficult to disentangle them, but they can be disentangled, and it's important to disentangle them because they have different effects, right? Subsidy can also be very much general, right? You can generally subsidize Islam by building lots of mosques and building madrasas and schools, or you can target your subsidies to only support one interpretation, a single interpretation of Islam. Right? So it's done in other religions as well. We can talk again more about that in the Q&A period if people are interested. What I want to emphasize here is the distinct ways in which I think the Central Asian governments, right, both distinct from the Soviet policy and distinct from other parts of the Islamic world, mix repression and subsidy. And I'm going to talk primarily about Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, where I think this is most prominent. Right? So the first is this notion of, or this practice of regulating not just public practice, right? Not just public expression of piety, but also private practice, right? So, in many ways, in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan particularly, the regulation of Islam has become much more intensive, right, than it was during the Soviet period. And that it's not just about reaching into and saying what practices are not publicly allowable, but also what private practices are not allowable. So in some of the recent work that David Abramson and Noah Tucker have done, they've talked about how the regulation of weddings and other life cycle events in Uzbekistan has become very, very strict, and where neighborhood mahallah committees are employed to enforce the state position, right? And it's interesting because it's also, as I'll mention later, inconsistent, right? So you should have religious funerals but secular weddings, right? So this kind of inconsistency, but also, this notion that the state can reach into your private practice of life cycle events, which we all know are so important in Central Asia. Official religious leaders are also allowed to make commentary on a much wider range of social issues than they ever were in the Soviet period, right? So you see just a much more extensive reach in terms of, and so again, you see this repression on the one hand of things that the state doesn't accept as Islamic, right? The state is the ultimate arbiter of what is Islamic and what is not, just like under the Soviet period, right? But here, it goes even further, I would argue, repressing those aspects that it sees as un-Islamic at the same time that it's subsidizing those practices that it sees as Islamic in the sense of the state's version of Islam. And this leads us to the second point, which is another way in which there's this distinctiveness in the mixture of repression and subsidy in the post-Soviet Central Asian context, is this notion of promoting one interpretation of Islam. And doing it in this very pluralist context. As I showed you earlier, there's this context of this pluralism of piety, and yet the state wants to promote a single interpretation of Islam, of what constitutes proper behavior for an Uzbek Muslim or a Tajik Muslim. And here it's not just, Sufism, and it's not just Hanafi doctrine, right? It's not that general. It's actually very specific to what the state interpretation of Sufism is. It's very specific to what the state interpretation of the Hanafi doctrine is, right? So it's not a general subsidy, it's a very specific subsidy, even within these general categories. So it's okay to go and worship shrines, or excuse me, it's okay to go and visit shrines, but it's not okay to worship them. It's not okay to worship Sufi saints. But you can go and visit shrines for educational purposes, right? It's okay, so I won't say any more about that. And it's also a moving target. These things change and shift all the time. And part of the reason why these policies seem so inconsistent, and part of the reason why these policies do shift over time, and this mixture of repression and subsidy, is because the motivation here is very different. This is the third way in which I think the Central Asian policy is very different from the Soviet policy. It's not motivated by ideology, as it was. Whether you agree or disagree with ideology in the Soviet system, it was motivated primarily by ideology. It was motivated by atheism, right? And then it was motivated by rule of law over repression. That's sort of what was motivating Soviet policy for religion in general, and Islam in particular. In Central Asia, it's very much being motivated by self-preservation, by declining legitimacy of these leaders, and by the fear that that Islam is the only sort of alternative that could unseat these leaders. Again, speaking to some of the domestic motivations for repression that don't come from the international context per se, but come from the own inability of some of these leaders to govern effectively, right, and to build their own economies. Again, precisely because the motivation is self-preservation and not ideological, you see a lot of policy changes and shifts over time. Policy seems often like a moving target. There's a much greater fluctuation than during the Soviet period. As I mentioned before, there's lots of inconsistencies. Sometimes policies seem confusing. They seem confusing if you're thinking about it in terms of an ideological motivation. But if you're thinking of it in terms of a self-preservation motivation, then it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense that you want to have religious funerals, which are smaller, right, and secular weddings, which are smaller, because you want to avoid groups congregating, right? That you want to highly regulate the celebration of Sufism, and you want to highly regulate pilgrimages to mosque because you want to make sure that they're not done en masse, right? So there is a logic. It's just not an ideological logic. It's a logic of what I think David will talk about later. It's a logic of authoritarianism. And Sebastian, I think, is going to talk a little bit about this as well. Yeah. So for all these reasons, I think, and others in this room have argued, the potential impact of Islam in Central Asia is also greater. It's arguably much greater than it was ever in the Soviet period, right? Where you have high repression coupled with high subsidy for a specific interpretation of Islam on society, it's likely that there's going to be a greater retreat or effort to find an alternative to that single interpretation, right? Just as subsidy in other contexts encourages people to retreat from the dominant state religion. In Central Asia, subsidy, highly targeted subsidy for a single state interpretation of what is Islamic can cause people to adopt the exact alternative of what is the state interpretation. Third, I think we've gained insights into these sources I talked before of internal influence that were largely ignored for most of the 1990s and that we couldn't really study under Soviet rule. I think there is research has revealed that there actually is a very strong role and influence of internal sources. That these have really proliferated, the sort of competing sources of internal sources of Islamic authority. They're not only multiple, they're often competing. There's old ones, quote unquote, that we've seen before, but they're adopting new roles, they're adopting new approaches, there are new markets. There's the emergence of new religious specialists, right, that are responding to greater demand, right? And these are things that we started to track more in the mid to late 2000s. We are increasingly taking stock of these religious specialists, trying to document what they do, understand what they do, whether they're healers or shamans or unofficial custodians of shrines, purveyors of amulets, etc. These are things, again, that we ignored for the first decade, roughly, after this collapse of the Soviet Union, and that we really couldn't study during the Soviet rule. But they're very important sources. Some of the research that I've done recently has revealed that people really look to these local sources of authority much more than they look to sort of their central or centralized sources of authority. We also have more and more evidence that there's a real inability of the state to limit these internal sources. So it's not just that these internal sources exist and that people seek them out, but the state has, particularly in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, tried to limit the role and influence of these alternative religious authorities, and been unable to for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, they've been unable to because of weak capacity in some cases. This is certainly true of the Tajikistan, the inability to wipe out or eradicate these internal sources. In some cases, because they've been unable to, if you can't beat them, join them, right? So if you can't eliminate or eradicate these sources, then you can try and co-opt them, right? So that's been a strategy that Tajikistan and Uzbekistan have tried. The other reason that the states are unable to control these competing sources of religious authority is that some of these sources really just can't be controlled. They're not controllable, right? So something we're going to hear about a lot tomorrow is the role of the internet and social media, right? This notion that you can only control it to some extent, right? And in Uzbekistan in particular, there's been an attempt on the part of the government to try and to co-opt these sources and to have its own websites, but in fact it's very difficult to completely block off. The more technologically savvy young people become, the more difficult it becomes to completely block off these alternative sources of authority. So the government finds itself increasingly competing with these in a way that the Soviets never did, the Soviet authorities never did. It's also the case that religious authority itself is very diffuse and it's highly localized. So again, in some of these interviews that we conducted last summer, a team of researchers in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, we found that people could identify multiple sources of authority within their own neighborhood, within their own community, that they would go to for very different types of problems or issues or questions, right? So that's who they would seek out, not necessarily just family members, and certainly not the state, but perhaps a website that they trusted or a local authority who they trusted. And what this, I think, means for Central Asian governments, and something for us to look at and think about more, is that there's a real danger in, again, in establishing or trying to establish a single source of authority, right? It goes hand in hand with this idea of establishing a single interpretation of what is Islamic and what is not. It's dangerous because in some cases it can elevate a fundamentalist discourse that the state doesn't really want to elevate. This is what some argue has happened in Kyrgyzstan, where this centralization, not so much by state actors, but by non-state actors, this effort to sort of centralize what is Islamic and what's permissible in the independent muftiyat, has really made people look to this independent muftiyat, right, for a single interpretation, and it's one that is actually more fundamentalist, which is not what the Kyrgyzstani state wants to disseminate. Finally, I think what we've gained by eschewing some of these dominant perspectives that blinded us in the 1990s at least, is a more nuanced and therefore more accurate understanding of transnational Islam's influence. And I think this conference is really going to hit on a lot of points here, so I won't spend much time. But I think one of the things we've learned, certainly with recent work, is that these transnational Islamist groups are, if they're going to have any traction, have to localize themselves. They have to adapt their messages to the local context. So it's not sort of just international, transnational forces coming to Central Asia and imposing, right, beliefs and standards and interpretations, but rather having to sort of interact with the local traditions and standards and expressions. One example of this is Tagli Jamaat in Kyrgyzstan, where they, for example, encourage women to wear traditional headscarves as a sign of piety. So you don't have to do hijab. You can continue to wear. It's really about, for you, what that means. If it means for you as a sign of piety, then so be it. And I think that's an important element that we've missed for these groups. The other is that the motivations for joining such groups, whether it's Tabligh Jamaat or it's engaging in Islamic banking or whether it's studying abroad, go beyond piety, or what we would think about as a very sort of, again, conservative, unidirectional notion of piety. People study abroad for a variety of reasons, including increasing their local status, their status in the community, and therefore increasing or elevating their marriage prospects, right? And that's something that's come out of more recent work, again, by some of the people in this room. Finally, what we've uncovered, what some in this room have uncovered, and what I think this conference will touch on today, is that there are other sources of radicalization besides these transnationalist movements. There's been so much focus on these transnational Islamists as the source of radicalization, right? These revivalist movements and the radical Islamists themselves, when in fact there's another more effective mechanism for radicalization, which is the virtual sources, the social media, and the diasporas that are seeking out, not just domestic individuals who are seeking out social media to answer some of the questions that they have and to get a variety of perspectives that they're not getting from the state, to seek the education that they're not getting from the state, but also diasporas who find themselves abroad and are seeking out the social media as a way of, again, educating themselves and connecting themselves with their community at home. So just to summarize, I think that, again, there is sort of an accumulation of knowledge, at least in my view, and I'm willing to hear you tell me that I'm wrong about this, but I think there is an accumulation of knowledge. I do think we have gained over the last decade or so a perspective that tells us that the revival itself is multifaceted, unpredictable, right? We should be securitized by now. We've been saying that, I think, for at least a decade, if not more, and really think about, what Islam means to people on the ground and try and disaggregate it from its political impact, its broader political impact. That state policies themselves are very diverse, right? They're evolving, right? There's something that's to be watched. They're distinctive from both Soviet policies and other parts of the Islamic world. That internal sources have a very strong influence on the revival and the nature and the meaning of the revival, and we should pay attention to those internal sources. We should also look at state efforts to try and control those internal sources. And finally, that the influence of transnational Islam has been, I think, not just exaggerated, but misunderstood. It's not to say that outside influences are important, but to say that there are different kinds of outside influences and different mechanisms whereby outside influence has an effect than just simply these radical Islamist groups crossing borders. Yet another reason to finally put the nail in the coffin on the securitization of Central Asian Islam. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Should I call my own one? Okay, so sir, go back.
Henry Hedger, researcher now. I wondered, is there anything like a matrix or grid that would show religious toleration protected in constitutions in, say, Central Asia and all these various nations? Another question would be the problem with ethnic toleration. We already witnessed what happened with Uzbekistan. That's a separate issue. And can this be compared to, say, the situation in Latvia, where the Russian-speaking people are now required to learn Latvian? Their children will have to really be Latvians as opposed to just Russians living, in the area. I don't know for sure exactly what the situation is in, Central Asia, but it's another question mark. And of course, Ukraine itself shows the difficulties in assimilating peoples of various ethnic backgrounds and religions. Witness the recent disturbances. I don't know what can be done about it all, but it's clearly a very sensitive issue, a political question and a sensitive issue. So I wondered what research has been done on this.
So I think there's quite a lot of research that's been done on let's say, the codified, legal regulatory approach toward Islam in Central Asia. I think we have lots of evidence, and I myself have a database, other people in this room probably do, of all the laws that have been passed. The real question is the extent to which those laws on the books are enforced, right? And there's often, outside of Uzbekistan, I would say, which is fairly good at enforcing its policies, there's little, or at least there's not very consistent enforcement of those policies, right? But people are aware of them, right? And most enforcement is localized, right? So it's very important what goes on in the local and regional level governments. So to have an inventory of those laws is very important, but it doesn't tell us everything. It obviously doesn't give us the full picture, right? And you have things too that are they're sort of ironically named the law on the freedom of religion in Uzbekistan, which is nothing about. There's no freedom there. It's very constraining. So it's a misnomer. So you really have to sort of read between the lines. But there are definitely lots of evidence database collected on the codification. I think what we need more on is the implementation and how that works. And that's the really hard part. And that's why it's so important to get scholars on the ground to do that kind of work that has the language training and the cultural knowledge to do it. In terms of ethnic toleration, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. We've spent so much time thinking and focusing on Islam as the issue, and most of the conflict, or whether it's civil conflict or it's international conflict, in the village is going to come from radical Islam, right? It's going to come from these groups rising up. When in fact, more of the violence we've seen has been of an ethnic nature. That said, I wouldn't presume from that there's an ethnic intolerance. Rather, there are factors, there are social and economic factors that exacerbate or politicize, ethnic differences. Right? There's not sort of a baseline ethnic intolerance that is predominant in Central Asia. But certainly, scarce resources will exacerbate these types of ethnic tensions. In terms of your language question and assimilation, where you see the largest number of Russians in terms of the percentage of the population in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, you really don't see forced assimilation. Others can disagree with me if this is their reading of it, but you really don't see it. And where there's a majority, a very dominant majority, like in Uzbekistan, the Uzbeks, there's no need to enforce assimilation because there are very few Russians left. Right? So that's not a real big issue. It's not a Latvian situation where you have this run Latvian or go quote unquote to Russia. I haven't seen evidence of that, but others might disagree. So, David, you had your hand up.
Hi, David Abramson, State Department. It's interesting when I like the way you've provided this overview, and it gives a lot to think about where we are, where we were, where we're going. And it almost seems like just as we're getting beyond this securitization approach of what's going on within Central Asia's borders, there's a new re-securitization set of questions that are coming up with respect to diaspora communities, labor migrants, the flows, who's going to Syria via Russia or anywhere else or directly from Central Asia. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, perhaps through the lens of what constitutes internal influences. You raised the work of Noah Tucker and Sarah Kendzior on virtual virtual borders, and so there's a lot of that that's going on. I'm wondering if you could comment on how do we move forward with this new re-securitization.
Yeah, so I think it's a slight exaggeration to say that it's a re-securitization to talk about these issues. I think that what we're doing is talking about them in a more nuanced way. And so we're recognizing that there are actually multiple influences and multiple things going on, right? And they're going to have an impact depending upon, again, the social and political context, right? The context of labor migrants is one in which they're seeing lots of injustices. Those injustices are being communicated and framed in a very anti-Muslim way. So they're seeing connections with, and this has happened with it's not just the Central Asians that are feeling this, right? The Syrians are feeling this, the Turks are feeling this. There are other Muslim communities in outside of their, diasporas or labor migrants outside of their home country that are feeling this, and where their frustrations and the indignities they're suffering are being framed in this way. Right? It's a very powerful framing to say this isn't just against you as a Uzbek, it's against all Muslims, right? It's against Tatars and Uzbeks in Russia or whatever. And Tajiks, etc. So I think that again, it's seeing this, again, multiple sources of influence, multiple mechanisms whereby someone might become radicalized. not just focusing on transnational Islamists as the source of that radicalization, and understanding that all of this is embedded in this sort of larger social and political context, you know, and I know you get, I know you understand. And so it's not sort of this race to judgment that we should only think about the security aspects. This is all about security, right? A lot of it's about social and political dynamics. A lot of it's about economic reform, right? Why are there labor migrants in, you know, Russia being mistreated? Well, because they can't work in their own economies, right? Why can't they work in their own economies? Because there hasn't been, you know, sort of any kind of real economic reform that allows people to make a living, right? So basic property rights, for example, right? You have these very predatory states, and you have these collapsing economies without reform, and so people migrate, right? It's not, at the end of the day, then, a security issue, it's an economic issue, right? So I think that we jump, and we, when I say we, I mean the United States government, and I don't know why I'm saying we. I mean, there's a tendency, and there has been a tendency, to jump to security issues as the frame, the primary frame, when there are equally important, if not more important, economic and social issues. So, again, I think I'm reacting to your comments. I think it's an exact. I don't mean to imply that we should go back to a securitization framing for this or understanding of it, but rather that it is. And I'm also saying that there are some security issues, right? There are security issues created by these diaspora communities seeking out links with transnational Muslim groups or opportunities to be jihadis in Syria. There are security issues, for sure, with that. But that's not either the main reason why this is occurring, or nor should it be our focus in terms of policy towards relations. Only think about what are the security threats and the risks, and only frame those security threats and risks in terms of Islamists or radical Islam, as opposed to authoritarian leaders who can't govern. Right? Sure, yes, sure.
Luong, Indiana University. Just kind of question, comments. Well, thank you for a great presentation, but this diagram, when you put like a mistakes, spiritual, and
yeah. Tell me what's wrong with it.
Scriptural. So where we should put like millions of Central Asians who are secular, but their identity is Muslim. I mean, they neither spiritual nor scripturalist, but for example, the secular guys, I don't know, using Facebook, drinking Starbucks coffee, working in big companies, they learning, for example, maybe they're going to Mosque, maybe not, but if they would talk with them, they will tell, yeah, I'm a Muslim, yeah, it's part of my identity, but it's only part of their and I agree with it, it's a multifaceted identity, I mean, and it's like millions of them, I mean, living in Central Asia. So and second is about like when we start talking about state politics, how state actually is efficient. I mean, this vertical, like somebody's like made an order in Astana, for example. I mean, from Kazakhstan, and it's like 2 years of field research done in Kazakhstan. So and after that, immediately this order will be, for example, done in some local village, like 600 kilometers. And at the same time, this local official, he's ethnic Kazakh, and he venerates shrine, for example, local shrine. And that's, I mean, how state is actually really working in this. Or you can see, for example, some hakims or akims, elders or heads of village oblasts, who, for example, totally against some, I don't know, local elements of Islam. I mean, this, it's a high level of diversity, plus high level of transnationalism, globalization, modern technologies, gadgets, everything is going and changing. I mean, it's and we cannot. I mean, my impression is that we cannot separate like a focus only, for example, or on scriptural tradition or shrine veneration, because outside of it, it's its life is going on, and people involved in many processes, which forms their identity. Sorry.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah, there were a lot of questions in there, but I think I'm going to parse out two. That's okay. So, so the first one was, what about secular Uzbeks? Like, what about secular Central Asians? Not just Uzbek, but what about secular Central Asians? Or where do they fit into this diagram? So part of what I'm trying to do in my own research is I'm trying to rethink the way that we as scholars, particularly political scientists, approach religion, and where we've seen it mostly unidimensional on this aspect of how closely people adhere to the textual or scriptural dictates of their religion, whether it's Catholicism or Protestantism or Islam, it doesn't matter, right? So the questions in surveys are things like, how many times do you pray a day? If you say 5, then ching, you're a good Muslim. If you say 2, right? So that's, and then we use that to kind of, that's what we do as political science, it's very crude, right? we place you on a continuum of how fundamentalist you are, how pious you are, right? And so I'm saying that that's only unidimensional, it's one dimension, but religion has this separate dimension, this dimension that's more spiritual and mystical. And if you see religion as two-dimensional as opposed to one-dimensional, then you can pick up people, for example, who solely visit shrines and engage in things like consult healers and mystics and would see themselves here, but believe themselves to be as pious as people who are here, right? So this is a way of saying I'm only dealing here with people who are religious, who identify themselves as religious. And so part of the work that I've done with these interviews, or these detailed, intensive cognitive interviews in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan with a couple of my graduate students, is that we've tried to really look at and find out that once people identify themselves as religious, not just ethnic Muslims, right? Because as you rightly said, people have these identities that are complicated, right? So you can identify yourself as an ethnic Muslim because you're born Muslim, or because by virtue of being an Uzbek or Kazakh you're Muslim, right? Ethnically identified, versus a practicing Muslim. And we try to make that distinction very clear. Once you consider yourself a practice Muslim, then you're asked about sort of what kinds of behavior you engage in that makes you a practicing Muslim, and then what makes you a pious Muslim, what makes those in your communities a pious Muslim. And what we find is that people describe a variety of different, both for themselves and their people in their community around them, a variety of different practices that combine many things we would consider to be textually or scripturally based with mystically and spiritually based. So the long-winded answer to your question is this doesn't include seculars, right? Although you could see seculars engaging in this behavior, right?
So you can jump from one stage to
Sure. Oh yeah, people can jump all around. But engaging in this behavior, but not considering that as part of their religious identity, but rather their ethnic identity, which is completely consistent with also what happened under Soviet rule, right? And some argue that it persists. Some, like I did Pauline, would argue that that persists, this notion that being a Muslim is part of your ethnic identity as primary to your religious identity persists. I think that's changing a lot for people. I think people are starting to at least in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where I've done my most recent research, is they're starting to identify what was considered ethnic practice, traditional Kyrgyz or traditional Tajik, with religious. And what's interesting is that the more people are starting to see what was previously defined as ethnic as religious, the more I think potential there is for mobilization based on religion. Not necessarily radical Islamism, right? But mobilization based on religious grievances.